Hey there. Today's bonus podcast is all about my recent trip to Silver Dollar City with my daughters. It's a real gem of a park that may have more to offer than you might expect. So I'm going to tell you all about that trip and some of the highlights that might make you think about taking your own journey over to Silver Dollar City. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 77 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton, and I had not planned to do a podcast about my trip to Silver Dollar City recently. It was more of a spur-of-the-moment trip that I decided that my daughters and I would take a one-night trip. We basically drove there the day before, spent a full day at Silver Dollar City, and then drove back. And we had a blast. And as we were there, as I thought more about the whole experience, I felt like, there's something here that's worth talking about here on the podcast, especially as maybe a shorter episode that really just gives you a snapshot of what we experienced there and some of the attractions that make the park so cool. So I live in St. Louis, and Silver Dollar City is located just west of the main Branson area. Now, I am not a big Branson person. I feel like it's just a bit too much, a bit gaudy, a bit on the conservative side of things. I don't have a problem if you enjoy it. It's just not really my place to go. So we went a few years back. I spent a few days there, and I felt like that was enough. That was okay. But I did really want to go back and experience Silver Dollar City more. We had only been there a few hours that time, and I wanted to go and do a lot more. Plus, my daughters are getting a bit older, so we could do more attractions, and I thought it would be a fun trip. So we did the drive, which is about 3 hours and 45 minutes, basically just shy of 4 hours if you don't really stop. It's an easy drive from St. Louis, and I'm sure that's also the case if you're coming from Kansas City or even some other cities more to the west of Missouri, because Branson, you're getting pretty far into the southwest corner of Missouri. So the one nice benefit, especially for people like me that don't want to deal, it's not even just about what I said about Branson. It's also that there's really bad traffic. You think about it, it's basically a small road that takes you right through that area. I wanted no part of that. So we stayed in a hotel, the Best Western Branson Inn and Conference Center, that was very close to Silver Dollar City and did not require us to drive through any of that traffic, which was super nice since we were only going for one day and staying one night. Similar to how you would treat something like Walt Disney World, we were trying to stay as close as possible. And this hotel is so close to Silver Dollar City, if you can believe it. You can't walk there really, but you essentially just get in the car, pull out one street, go to the next block, and you're there. They also have free shuttles from the hotel. And this is a hotel that's more on the older side of things in terms of the quality. But it was clean, and given the proximity and the fact that it was less than $100 per night, it worked out perfectly. And that's the thing when you think about a place like Silver Dollar City. It's a regional park. It does have enough to bring people in that don't live right there. This is not Six Flags St. Louis, which I have covered previously on the podcast. There's a lot more there, including better entertainment and food options and all types of attractions. I mean, I'm going to talk about some of the roller coasters, which are definitely worth the trip if you're a big coaster fan. And also there's a lot of odd gems and old school attractions where even if you're not a big fan of roller coasters, you can still have a great experience. And I hate to keep comparing this to Six Flags, but that was also the comparison my daughters made because we had gone there back in June and they were talking about how much better and different it was. And I'll talk about as we go along some comparisons to what it's like to go to Walt Disney World and also comparisons to Six Flags and other amusement parks. Silver Dollar City is not on the scale of Disney World, but it is definitely a step up from the scale of your typical local amusement park. And it's also a really good value. And there's a lot to do, and you're not going to spend nearly as much as you might at some other parks. And at the end of this, I'm also going to have a quick interview with my daughter Elise, who's also appeared previously on my episodes about our trip to Marceline, and then this past March when we went to Aulani in Hawaii. So let's do it. Let's take a trip to Silver Dollar City. So if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you may remember that I talked to Matt Parrish, who's the host of Wedway Radio and the 3028, who lives in the Springfield area. And Springfield is about 45 minutes from Silver Dollar City. And at the end of that podcast, we spent about 10 minutes or so talking about Silver Dollar City and a few of the attractions there. So that episode is a good precursor to this one, and that was recorded back in April of last year. I'm going to go further into describing some of these attractions here than we did during that interview. And I also wanted to mention that Silver Dollar City is owned by the Herschend Company, who also operate Dollywood. And so if you hear some attractions here, or even the way I describe it, and you think, that sounds a lot like Dollywood, or things that were there even before it became Dollywood as the earlier version, that is not a coincidence. There is definitely a connection between these two parks, including very similar attractions that I will mention in a few cases. But I want to start by talking about the most unique thing that you will experience at Silver Dollar City. And no, it is not their most recent coaster, Time Traveler, which I'll talk about a bit later. It is Marvel Cave. Yes, Silver Dollar City is a park that has a cave below it. A cave that is not, we're not talking some sort of clever tourist trap cave or something where they just build something as an extra little thing that you get to explore. This is not Injun Joe's cave from the Tom Sawyer Island. This is a real cave. Again, it's called Marvel Cave. It's included in the ticket price. This is an experience that takes 1 to 2 hours, that takes you more than 500 feet below the ground, and they're not upcharging you. Could you imagine in a case where Disney had something like this, or even close to like this, that they would not charge more for this, even if it was inside the park? It's one of the greatest values you're ever going to experience at a theme park, especially given that the tickets to get into the entire park were only about $50, and this was for a one-day ticket. They have a lot of deals where you can buy a ticket and stay another day. Even the season pass is not that expensive. If you're going for multiple days, which you likely want to do, I don't think we really could do everything in one day. It was okay when you're going with girls that are 10 and 6 because they don't have the energy to really power through for multiple days at the pace we were going. But I think if you're going to make the trip there, you'd want to go probably at least for 2 days, given all the entertainment and different options. And this cave is a perfect example because it is a pretty significant timed experience. We actually did this at the very end of the day, and I had done it when I was younger. I did not remember it was this long, and they are very good up front of giving you a lot of warnings, but also clarifying how long it's going to take. The fact that you can't leave in the middle, you have to really see it through, and that can be a little treacherous. Now I want to give a little background about the cave. It was discovered actually in 1884 by William Henry Lynch and his daughters, and they turned it into a tourist attraction, though I doubt it was as safe as it is now from what I've heard. And eventually it was leased by the Herschends in 1950. I mentioned them earlier. And then the theme park, Silver Dollar City, was built around the cave in 1960. And that park now, as you can understand, is approaching its 60th anniversary. But I was under the impression that the cave they built up the exploration of the cave after Silver Dollar City, but really it was built as something people needed something to do while waiting to get into the cave. So they built up kind of the Main Street general store area. And then as we got into the 1970s and beyond, they started adding attractions and eventually added more roller coasters and turned the park into what it is right now. So this experience, you imagine doing this experience with a 10-year-old and especially with a 6-year-old. I would tell you that while we did fine, my 6-year-old did great. There were no close calls. Everything went smoothly. I might recommend that you take kids that are a bit older. My 10-year-old did great. I think more in the realm of her age or above. I wouldn't say you couldn't do it with younger kids, but I'd be a bit wary of it. I was very nervous just given how many steps you're taking. The steps are wet. This is a real cave. And yes, they have put in some nice steps and railings to make it a lot safer. I never felt like there was something they did that was unsafe, but you're going through something that has basically barely been touched or set up since that time. You start by entering this cathedral room, which goes down 300 feet. This is the largest cave entrance room in the United States, and you end up going more than 500 feet below the surface. There's a ton of walking here. I wouldn't say it's like exhausting. We all did okay, but it's a lot, especially if you do it near the end of the day when you've been at the park all day. Now, the flip side is if you do it first, you may not have the energy to do everything else. That's where I think the 2-day approach really comes into play well, or maybe you spend a day and you just do the cave and some other entertainment and then hit more of the rides on the second day. There's a lot of different ways you could do it. And I also wanted to mention, you go through, you see a lot of amazing sights, and I will be doing a separate blog where I just talk about the experience of going through the cave and include my pictures that I had from it. At the very end, thankfully, because you go down so far, and the whole thought is we're going to have to walk back up. But they do have a unique style cable train from 1957 that you hop into for the last half mile or so. So while you do start to climb up, it's not completely there. And that's an interesting experience. Getting into a train inside a cave and then ultimately pulling it back to the surface, I was a bit nervous that it would work, especially after all the warnings they gave, but everything ended up working out fine, and it was a really fun experience. It's one of those types of things where I think, even as we were doing it, I was like, I can't believe we get to do this at a place that has rides and not, it's an amusement park. It's a regional park that's better than that. But it's still not the kind of thing you expect to do. And I know I had done it before, at least once as a teenager, but we're talking more than 20 years ago. I did not have a good memory of going through that cave. And I think part of me is glad that I didn't, because I might have hesitated to do it. And all of us came out of that like, wow. My 10-year-old daughter especially, she just kept saying, wow, this is something amazing. She's gone to another local cavern. It's called Merrimack Caverns, which is fun, but it's nothing on this level. It's a lot more touristy. It's more comfortable, but it's not at the same scale. It's a good starting point for going in a cave, but this is something else entirely. And I think it's worth the trip to Silver Dollar City if you can do it almost just to see this, and everything else is just a bonus. Another really cool attraction that I enjoyed a lot was the Flooded Mine. It actually opened in 1968, but it was very different. Now it is more of a mix of Buzz Lightyear with Pirates of the Caribbean. They added the guns and targets in 1990. Basically, to describe it, you're going through on a boat ride where prisoners that have to work at this mine are trying to escape as it floods. So you pass a lot of show scenes with prisoners trying to get out or being stuck or just kind of hanging out in the mine, and you're shooting at targets. I think the general idea is you're supposed to be shooting the prisoners to keep them from getting out, though luckily you never have to shoot any of them. You're shooting targets nearby, and there's some targets that interact with you in a sense. If you hit them, a bell rings or a shovel moves. But it's definitely more in the technology of the 90s rather than the technology now. But I appreciate that because unlike so many interactive rides now, like your Justice League Battle for Metropolis, where you're essentially just shooting at screens, this you're going through a ride that even if you weren't using the guns, would be entertaining just as an experience to ride through show scenes. And I mentioned Pirates, which opened around the same time. It's not on that level of immersion, and also in terms of the figures, which mostly are static figures or they're moving very slightly. But it still has that feel in a sense. There's even a theme song. You don't hear much of it. You hear it in the queue, and the queue they are doing this kind of welcome to the mine, welcome to the toil. And there's music playing. You also hear that theme a bit during the ride, but it's super muted. And the fact that everyone's going around and shooting and the guns are making noise and there's a lot of other audio in the ride, you're not going to really hear that in too many places. But again, that kind of connects to Pirates in a way because you have a theme song and you're going through kind of this experience of various rooms. And the added fact of being able to shoot and get points was very fun. The guns are a little goofy. Sometimes they didn't reset from the previous ride, so you'd start with 300,000 points. Other times they had a gun that didn't work as well, that had a really hard time registering any points. Of course, part of that could be my own errors, but it's a lot of fun, and I appreciate that it's still there at Silver Dollar City. We rode it 4 times. Each time it's like 10 minutes or so. There was no line at all, partially because it loads very quickly. And these boats are actual boats where you have to balance out where you sit. It's not just a case where you're riding completely on a track and the boat is just for show. They have little red dots on the seats that you have to sit in a certain spot and basically spread out so that the boat doesn't tip or become a bit uneven. You have mostly like adult workers there, all dressed up in the costumes like the figures where they're prisoners, and I think that's a really nice touch too. And it's a fun ride. They used to have this in Dollywood. Well, it was actually in the Pigeon Forge version of Silver Dollar City in Tennessee, but I know it closed a while ago, and I still see things online about people missing that ride, which makes it even cooler that they have it here at Silver Dollar City. Another vintage attraction that is still at Silver Dollar City is Fire in the Hole, which was the park's first roller coaster, opening in 1972. And this is a really fun indoor coaster with just a few dips near the end and a lot of dark ride scenes. And it's one of the odder rides you're going to experience at any park. Basically, you're following a story where the town is being burned down by the Bald Knobbers. Again, kind of a similarity a bit to Pirates of the Caribbean in a sense, where you have vigilantes that are attacking a town. Now, this is interesting, though, because the Bald Knobbers wear hoods. And if you didn't know the story, you could easily think there was some connection to like the KKK or something with the hoods that they're wearing. But they're completely different. They supported the North during the Civil War. And I'm not here to make a pitch for the greatness of a vigilante group, but it is interesting seeing that, especially, there's pictures in the queue, you see them during the ride, and thinking, what are we actually watching here? But I think it's more about presenting kind of an odd look at a possible historical event. Whether it's very accurate or not is up to be seen. But it also connects to Marvel Cave, where the town you're seeing is a town that is referenced by the guide in stories about the early days of the park and of the cave itself. So there's an interesting connection between Fire in the Hole and Marvel Cave and the park itself. Another thing that's fun about this is that most people should be able to ride it if you don't mind, like I said, having a few drops at the end and not being sure exactly which direction you're going. This is one that my daughters actually rode with me when we went in 2016, when my one daughter was only 3 years old. And while it might have been a bit much for a 3-year-old, you kind of get the idea that it's not a particularly rough coaster. And what's good about that, even now going there with my girls, is you have an indoor ride you can do that still has enough thrills to be fun. The final drop is a bit of a splashdown. You get a little bit wet, though not very much compared to some of our other experiences. And you don't always know where it's going. You cross a bridge. There's kind of a Mr. Toad-like experience where a train is heading towards you, with a light again to show what that's like. It is a bit of a rough ride, especially if you ride in the back of the train, which we learned. We rode it twice. The first time we were in the front row, and the second time we rode in the back, and it is a rougher experience, which is really common for roller coasters, especially older ones. This is a ride where there is something very similar at Dollywood called Blazing Fury, and I've never ridden that, so I can only speak by what I've read online, but it seems to be extremely similar to Fire in the Hole. So if you've been to Dollywood, this may sound sort of familiar, the way this coaster is put together. And this was a case too where we were going to go a third time, and we went and waited in line for what our longest wait of the day was, which was about 10 minutes or so. And as we nearly got to the front, they came out and said the ride had actually shut down, and apparently had been shut down in progress. So people had to be evacuated from the ride, which was disappointing to my girls, but also shows that, yes, this is an older ride. So there are going to be things like that may happen with a ride that's been around since 1972. And they did cut out some scenes from the original version. You can still sort of see them when you're riding through and like, why are we not going that way? And that's because they did cut it down to increase capacity a bit, but it's still super fun. It has some very odd scenes and fits more in the dark ride mold than coaster mold. And I always appreciate when parks have indoor attractions that give you a break from the heat and also are just kind of peculiar for a variety of reasons, like I've mentioned, and Fire in the Hole fits the bill for all of those things that I look for in an attraction. So before I get to talking about the rest of our day at Silver Dollar City, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the roller coasters there. Some that I have experienced and some that I haven't so far. They have a really nice collection of coasters. The big prime coaster that's most recent is Time Traveler that opened last year. And this, when it opened, was the fastest and tallest complete circuit spinning roller coaster. And what I really like about this is the steampunk look of the vehicles and even of the sign, all inspired by Jules Verne. The queue, you walk through a clock factory. It's just a cool looking ride. And while a spinning coaster is like the last thing I want to do, it seems a bit smoother and not painful like your Primeval Whirl or something. Now, this is a lot more extreme than something like that or your typical like Tony Hawk type coaster. It's more for thrill seekers, but I don't get the impression it's just like looks to be just a painful, vomit-inducing experience. I haven't ridden it yet because going with my daughters, this was the first time I'd gone since it opened, but I did get a look at it and it looks super impressive and has been very highly reviewed. So it's something, if you're a coaster fan, you want to check out. The coaster that I have experienced is the last one, Outlaw Run, which opened in 2013. It's a Rocky Mountain construction coaster. This came out with the headline of the first wooden coaster with multiple inversions. Now, it's one of the modern coasters that are wooden, but are obviously more almost on the hybrid side. But I will tell you, that double barrel roll that you experience at near the end of the ride is one of the craziest things I've ever experienced on a roller coaster, because the barrel rolls, they turn you from the center of your body rather than a loop, which a lot of loops aren't really that hard to take, even for someone who might get motion sickness because it's so smooth. But when you're doing this, it's very aggressive. You are feeling that. And the fact that, the ride peaks at 68 miles an hour. One of the things that also is cool about all the roller coasters at Silver Dollar City is how well they use the terrain. It's interesting where you can walk through the park and you can barely see the coasters from the paths. They're hidden so well. So you get on a ride and you're not exactly 100% sure what you're going to see. You see a bit more from the queue, but it's not a case where the ride is just there in front of you and you're like, okay, we're going to go ride that because I know exactly what it's going to be. The only one we had a really good view of was Wildfire, and part of that is because you can see that from the parking lot. And I'll get to that in a moment. But Outlaw Run has a huge drop, and it's one of those cases where you don't go up as high as you drop because it's using the terrain so well. And it's so the drop is 162 feet, but the lift hill is only a little over 100. So you go up and it's a big hill, but you are not prepared for how big you are going to come down, and that is really consistent across all the coasters. I rode Outlaw Run when we went in 2016. I'm glad I did because it is one of the cooler coasters that I've experienced. My favorite roller coaster is the Voyage at Holiday World, but this one is in that conversation and fairly close. The Voyage is a bit more epic and doesn't feel as gimmicky possibly as these inversions, but even if you set aside the inversions, Outlaw Run is something to experience. It also has a really cool queue with a lot of interesting signs and different decor to really fit with the idea that you are the good guys and you are chasing down the outlaws is the way I understand it, at least from the queue. So another coaster that I've experienced is Thunderation, which is probably up after Fire in the Hole, the next step that you would take with kids or even as someone who's not as much into coasters. This opened in 93, and I've ridden it multiple times, including right around when it opened. It's like a mine train experience, but it does move faster and have more dips than like Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. And again, it's a terrain coaster because it goes through the woods. So in a sense, you get on this ride and you're not really sure where you're going. And then you head out and there's a very cool spot with a helix that goes in a circle and that really moves. And there aren't any giant drops, but it's just a fun experience. It's like the next step up. We didn't end up doing it this time because one of my daughters just was not interested in doing it. And the last thing I'm going to do is try and push that at all. And I think it might have been a bit much for her. So I think this was probably the best move because it is one of those rides that on the surface seems like, oh, this one's fine, but it has a little more aggression and a little more speed than you might expect. But if you're someone who can handle all the Disney coasters, including like Expedition Everest, this isn't even on that level as Expedition Everest in terms of speed and drops. So if you can handle that, and especially if you can handle Rock and Roller Coaster, Thunderation would be fine. Now, quickly go through the other coasters. One is Powder Keg, which is a steel coaster that has a launch and is a lot of fun also. And it's kind of the next step up from Thunderation if you're trying to get the tiers. And then, of course, there's Wildfire, the steel coaster with a bunch of inversions. This is more on the level of kind of a coaster you might see at a Six Flags or a Cedar Point type of coaster. I mean, it might not be on the level of some of the things at Cedar Point, but it has a high height requirement, a lot of inversions, and it is one that you generally will likely want to be a big coaster fan to experience. And then there's also one more kids coaster, the Grand Exposition coaster, which would fall as the kind of starter coaster for kids. I don't really think you need to do it. It's pretty typical that you might see at a carnival. I mean, it's a little more themed than that, and the line moves so slowly. So we did that in 2016, and this time we didn't even bother with it because there's enough other things to do that I was not going to spend time on a coaster. That my girls have done coasters at Disney. They've done coasters at other parks. This is not going to excite them that much. They're old enough now. But if you have like a thrill-seeking 4-year-old or even a kid who just wants to try a coaster for the first time, this is a good starting point even before you do Fire in the Hole or especially Thunderation. I want to talk now about the water rides for Silver Dollar City. They used to have 3 water rides, but they actually have removed the Lost River of the Ozarks, which is the raft ride that is similar to something like Cali River Rapids or anything you'd see at multiple parks. The one in St. Louis is Thunder River. They removed that, and they have a giant area that's all blocked off for construction, and it looks like they are starting to work on it, but they haven't made any announcements yet. So the thought is there's going to be a big announcement for the 60th anniversary of the park. I suspect we're going to hear something in the next month or so. So this is going to be really interesting because what they're building looks like more than just like a ride or something. I think they may be building an entirely new area, possibly a waterfront area, hopefully with some type of attraction. They put in a lot of roller coasters, so I would love to see some type of dark ride being added once again to kind of go along with the older rides that they have, but I know that it's fairly rare to have new dark rides coming into regional parks overall beyond your Justice League, which Six Flags then put in a lot of parks. So it will be interesting to see what happens there. They still have 2 water attractions. The one we rode first is American Plunge, which is the log flume. That was actually our second ride of the day, which ended up working out fine because it wasn't cold out. We had lucked out with the weather. It was in the upper 70s by the time we got there in the morning. So we went on American Plunge, which actually this started out as the Jim Owens float trip, which was a water ride that was not a log flume, but went by some like really basic scenes and such. And a lot of those scenes are still in place. And then they have put the log flume in that same spot, though it's much different than it was at that time. And it opened way back in 1981, so this is hardly a new log flume. It kind of fits more with those kind of old school type flumes where you essentially are just kind of biding time and going through the water until you hit the big drop. I mean, it starts out going through a large dark tunnel where you keep expecting something to happen and nothing really does. Then you go past a few show scenes, go up a large hill, and then a pretty steep drop, which is about the same length of distance as Splash Mountain, but it is steeper than Splash Mountain and a bit faster, and we got soaked. And that's another thing where I'm used to going to log flumes like at Six Flags or others where you barely even get wet and you're kind of disappointed. This one, I was riding behind my daughter and it went right over her head and hit me right in the face. Like the entire splash. It was a huge splash. So that is something to be aware of, but it's also very nice for hot days. The log flume actually is fairly close to the entrance. When you come into Silver Dollar City, you can kind of step to the right where you're heading towards Time Traveler and Thunderation and even other things like the Flooded Mine and the Railroad. Or you can go left where you run into American Plunge, Wildfire, and a little further down is Powder Keg and Fire in the Hole. So, and there are very steep hills when you are walking. So this is a case where you don't really want to do a lot of backtracking. When you come in, you're going downhill. And when you go back at the end of the day, you're going up, which can be a little tough when you're tired with kids. But it was fun to get a little wet right up front, and the girls really enjoyed that. Later in the day, we rode Tom and Huck's River Blast. We rode it several times, once before and after lunch. And this is one of those rides similar to, like, they call it at Six Flags the Tsunami Soaker, but this is much better than that because we also experienced that in June and got very wet. But that's a situation, at least at Six Flags St. Louis, where you're on basically a turntable, and the whole point is that you are basically able to shoot the other riders constantly, and there is no possible way to avoid getting soaked, but you're essentially not really making any progress. You're going in a big circle. It's not a boat ride in a way where you're actually moving through scenes. And that is the really cool thing about Tom and Huck's River Blast. One, the boats are super well themed. They have a really nice thing where they have a box at the end of, at the both ends of the boat where you can put all of your cell phones, wallets, whatever, in case you didn't bring Ziploc bags, which I brought. But still very nice to put all that stuff in there. It has a lid. There's no way it's getting wet in there. So you can enjoy the attraction without being super worried that you're messing up your valuables. So, and it's on the same vehicle you're on. So this is even different than like the cubby holes where you kind of like, I don't really want to leave my cell phone in a cubby hole and then go on a ride. That seems dumb. Here, I'm like 3 feet from it. Nothing's going to happen to it. And it's also protected. And so the fun thing about this, just to be clear, it's you're shooting water at both at other riders for a short time, at people outside who have found other shooters that can shoot back at you. In some places where they are up high and you are down low, you are at the mercy of people in the queue or in the exit that can get you. There's also targets you shoot that then sometimes shoot water back at you, or near the end in a nice touch can actually hit you with fans, which I really appreciate. Some of the targets do nothing, but some of them do have they make different things happen in the scenes, some having nothing to do with water. And it's just really well themed, especially for an attraction that really is just designed to get you soaked. This is not an attraction that is designed to do much else, but by making it feel like an experience where you're on the water and you're moving through a fairly long course, you don't feel like you're just sitting in the middle and experiencing a flat ride. It's actually a ride that's moving, which makes the theming really click. And then it's also fun to get out, and after you've been soaked by people, to then maybe go in and shoot some people that are on the ride. This is a case where you know what you're in for. The first time we actually lucked out, we didn't get as wet because there weren't as many people outside in the queue and exit. Second time, there were a lot of them, and there was no way. I was trying to lay on the ground or whatever, block it. There's nothing around it, but it was super fun. And especially when you're going with kids that may not love the coasters, this is another fun attraction that you can do that has enough theming where you don't feel as a parent or as a discerning theme park person like this is the dumbest thing I've ever experienced. It's actually a lot of fun. So I highly recommend, if you don't mind getting soaked, experiencing this at least once and possibly multiple times during your day. If you haven't been able to tell by now, there is a ton to do at this park. I anticipated this being a pretty short podcast, more of just a quick summary of what we did during our day, not as a full podcast, but this just keeps going on and we didn't even experience everything. There is a cool selection of entertainment that we didn't even really get to do, but not because we didn't want to. I mean, there's some things where I don't need to sit and see a band play Frontierland style music when I'm going to an amusement park, but it's still nice to have that background. But they also have an indoor show called Reuben's Swashbuckling Adventure, which was new for this year. This was their addition for the year, that has been described, at least by their marketing, as a Broadway style musical. We just ran out of time. We were in a situation where we wanted to do the cave. We wanted to still do a few other attractions and didn't really have a good window of time to do this attraction. And they also have other things. They kept broadcasting kid magic when we were walking by the kids area, which apparently was a magician that had been on America's Got Talent that was a kid. We didn't stop in for that. There's comedians, there's tons of music, and we did not spend time sitting there. But this is, again, kind of fitting with, if you're into the entertainment, having a second day is really helpful. Another thing we didn't do is the Frisco Silver Dollar Lane Steam Train, which that is a super cool thing. I love trains that go around the park, especially old style trains. The trick here was the train wasn't open in the morning. When we were in the area to go, it was closed. So then it became a situation where we went back a few times and it was always closed. And it finally opened, but then there were a lot of people waiting. And I think they weren't running it that frequently. So it's a case where we would have had to have waited a while and possibly 20, 30 minutes for the next train. When you're with kids too, they're a little anxious to do that. And I know they did want to do the train. This is another fun experience where I believe even there's a show that you experience when the train stops in the middle. I remember this from years ago, but this time we just weren't able to make it work. So that's another thing that you can really do that is more kind of in line with what you might see at a Disney park, with having the train that takes you all around the park and also offers an experience beyond just sitting and looking what you're looking at. So one thing I still want to talk about before I finish up are the kids areas. There are two massive kids areas that are really well themed. And that's something where my local Six Flags parks fail so miserably, is in the kids areas. They have a Bugs Bunny area with no shade, where it's the rides are very kid geared and boring, like off the shelf carnival rides. And there's nowhere even for the parents to sit or stand if they don't want to do it. And you just feel like you're baking in the blacktop. That is not the case here. This park in general has tons of shade, and you can tell was designed with the idea of either parents can ride certain things with their kids, or if they don't, like in some of the rides, it's really easy to stand nearby and get there. And this is another thing I should mention. Both of these areas have really well-defined entrances. There's one entrance and one exit. It's the same thing. There's one way to get in and out. So this is a case where you don't feel as freaked out about keeping track of your kids because they're, in a sense, there's only one way in and out. So if they're going to ride something, you're right there with them. I'm not saying you're going to leave them in the land or anything, but just having that ability of thought with how these were designed, both are more on the recent side with the areas, especially Fireman's Landing, which opened maybe like 5 years ago. Both of these areas are really cool. The one I enjoyed the most is the Grand Exposition area, which has 10 rides. It's themed to a World's Fair theme. The attractions are well done. It's just a beautiful area. And I don't want to oversell a kids area, but it's just an area that's comfortable to be in. This is not, the rides are spread out enough where you don't feel like they're all on top of each other. There's plenty of places to sit down. There's also some food stands nearby and everything. It's all put together very well. And there's actually some attractions there that were really fun for me. We did the Magnificent Wave Carousel, which is swings that actually got up pretty high. These were not the little kid swings. They do have one like that at Fireman's Landing, which is the other main area, but you get up pretty high and I could really feel it. And another one that really got to me is the Racing Regatta, which is like a racing ship, like something where you feel like you're kind of on a track and moving, but you're really going in a circle. There's some serious energy to that ride. It's aggressive. And I felt like basically Etta, my daughter, just slammed me into the side of the ride the whole time. It also rained while we were on that ride, which added to it. And then, of course, they have some attractions that are very similar to things you'd see at Disney World. I mean, the Elephant March, everyone I heard in the queue was just calling it Dumbo because it looks so much like it. And even you press a button, it goes up and down. They have the Royal Tea Party, which is like teacups. They also have things that are kind of normal, like going up and down on a pirate ship, which is very standard for. So some of these are more standard attractions that you'll see at a lot of parks, but the theming is better. And the second area is Fireman's Landing, which has 6 rides, but also has a bunch of play zones, including a water zone. There is a firehouse. It's basically themed to a firehouse where you go in. It's the nuttiest place ever, where basically the kids can shoot balls at you and at each other from up top and then down low. There's like different air shooters. It's an odd setup. And the kids go crazy in there, but it's also air conditioned and there are a few benches in there. But the closest thing I could think of is like the Dumbo area where you go in and it's pretty nutty, but you get to sit down while the kids play. This is not a queue for an attraction, but it's themed to an old firehouse, and everything in this Fireman's Landing is themed to like basically the fire department. Even you have things like, they have a pretty big launch, like basically kind of like a drop tower, but it's more one of those that goes up and down, not just takes you to the top and drops you. And then one designed for littler kids. They also have like swings, like I mentioned, and balloons, which are those balloons that go in a circle. And that actually made me feel a little woozy too. So the one thing is a lot of these attractions spin you in a circle. But the last thing I want to mention here is there were several rides, including the smaller like drop ride. And then there's one where you're riding a dog that I didn't have to do because the way they set it up, it was very easy. The kids could go in. I'm standing right there. I was able to get some good pictures and videos of them on it too. So there's some that parents don't have to do without feeling like they're just letting their kids wander away. They're right there. It's close together. And then others that parents can do and still have fun. So it's a nice mix. Both lands are well themed, and you could easily spend a good portion of your day just going on all those attractions. We did not go on all of them, but we went on, they went on 3 or 4 in each land, and that was enough to give them just a lot to do. I mean, if I look at our full day, we did 21 total rides, 15 different attractions. Like I said, we did Flooded Mine over and over. And that was in a span of about 8 hours. And that includes the time we spent in the cave, which was a good hour or two. So really you're looking at doing, like, if you take the cave out of the picture, 20 rides in about a span of 7 hours, which is really good. And we still stopped. We ate for a while. We ate at the Crossroads Pizza, and that took a while. That place is very busy. Luckily, we ate kind of later in the day. We also stopped at, which I highly recommend, Hannah's Ice Cream Factory, which is where it's like basically an indoor setting where they have, it's not soft serve ice cream. It's really good, a lot of different flavors, and it was excellent, like top-notch ice cream. I would go back there and almost just want to go get the ice cream right away. We had it later in the afternoon. And just to talk in general, there are a lot of dining options in the park. I know we ended up just eating pizza because my daughters are pretty picky eaters, but there's plenty of different things. A lot of it falls into theme park fare. But they also have a ton of snack stands where they make like kettle corn and chips and a lot of different kind of carnival type of things, but to the utmost level. The food is definitely a step up from your typical amusement park and a little cheaper because, like I mentioned, I hate to keep mentioning Six Flags St. Louis, but for instance, we went there and we got 3 8-inch pizzas and drinks and it was like $38. Where I went to Six Flags and there was one point where all we ordered was like popcorn and a pretzel and a drink, and it was like $25. So you get kind of the comparison here. Yeah, we at one point got some snacks and it was not that bad. Even the ice cream, for 3 of us to get ice cream and a bottled water, it was like $14. So it's not cheap. But if you kind of think of it in terms of bottled water, to me is always a good indicator of what places charge. Six Flags St. Louis, $5.50 for a bottled water. Disney, I think, is up like $4.50 now. This was like $3.50. So you kind of get the range of types of what they're charging for food. But there's plenty of options, and I wish I had more information about some of the other dining options. Now, there aren't a ton of not like they have nice sit-down places, but there's a good variety of types of food, especially when you're going to an amusement park where you don't expect much. This is a step up from the type of food you're going to experience at your local Six Flags. It's not on the Disney level, but it's a nice mix, and it's also not going to kill your pocketbook. Before I throw it to my conversation with Elise, I have to mention one more attraction, which is Grandfather's Mansion. And this is a walk-through fun house type experience where you could easily miss it. Near the main entrance, there's just a little pathway where there's a very small sign. We even were looking at the map. It could not figure out where it was. So the fact that we finally found it was kind of a surprise. And the kids love this. Basically, you walk in and you experience some kind of your typical kind of funhouse experiences. You may look in a mirror and look weird, or you look back and there's a light. But then you go into a room where everything is upside down, like basically a little bit like Figment at Journey into Imagination, where he turns his house upside down. You have Grandfather up, basically flipped up on the ceiling in a way, and then the rugs are on the ceiling, even where you're walking. Everything is very strangely put upside down, and that's really just the introduction. You go down some steps and then you go into this room that totally throws off your balance. It's tilted, and I don't totally know how they do the effect, but you have to hold on to railings as you try to walk through it. It kind of made me feel very odd and dizzy. But you walk through it. It's worth going in just for that experience. And there's still a lot of other small touches in there. The girls wanted to do it several times. And this is a thing that has been there forever. I'm not sure when it initially was put in, but it was there when I was younger. And it was another fun little added touch, was being able to go into that kind of fun house, but taken to another level. It never felt really cheap and just the most obvious things. There were some clever ones, and like I said, the one that throws off your equilibrium and you have to kind of fight your way through while trying not to kind of fall over, it's not dangerous at all, but is a really cool experience to do at Silver Dollar City. All right, so now I'm going to throw it to my brief interview with my daughter, Elise, who is 10 years old, and she's going to talk a bit about what she liked about Silver Dollar City. So here is my discussion with Elise Heaton. All right. Well, I am here with my daughter, Elise Heaton, who's back again to talk about Silver Dollar City. She was on 2 other times. We talked about Marceline last year and then about Alani in March. So, Elise, thanks for joining me here.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be back.
Well, thank you. It's always fun to hear your view on what's happening at the theme parks we visit. And we recently made a trip to Silver Dollar City. So what did you think of Silver Dollar City? Was it fun?
Yeah, it was pretty fun.
What were some of your favorite things that we did there?
Well, the cave was pretty fun, and Fire in the Hole was always fun. In the flooded mine.
Yeah, so Fire in the Hole, what did you like about that one?
Because it's kind of like cool because it's like a coaster plus there's animatronics.
Yeah, and it's a pretty old ride, and so is the flooded mine. So, what did you enjoy about some of these older rides?
The animatronics, and how they were like slight water rides. How you got maybe a couple drips wet, but not that wet.
Yeah, well, we also got very soaked on a few other rides, too. So, did you enjoy the water rides in the park?
Yeah, they were pretty great.
Well, that's good. You also mentioned the cave. What was cool about the cave, Marvel Cave, that we went to?
Well, I know there's like Merrimack Caverns and stuff like that, but this was something you actually had to walk down like 500 steps, and you went through tight spaces, and you went down about half a mile, and
So if for other kids of near your age or around, what would you recommend that you think it's okay for a 10-year-old, or what's the right age for the cave?
Well, I say it's probably about, if you really want to experience it, you probably should be around 7 or 8.
Yeah, I think that's about right. Your sister is 6, and she might have been a little too little, though she did a good job. So speaking of kids, there are several kids areas in Silver Dollar City. You have the Grand Exposition and the Fireman's Landing. Did you enjoy some of those kids' rides? Was it a cool area?
Well, the Fireman's Landing is amazing and how it's so new, and some of the kids' rides were pretty fun, but I mean, like, most of them are good for toddlers, and you can find other kids' rides that are kind of like a step up, like the Elephant March. You could find the Fire Dog that was kind of underneath, so it's kind of like you could pick your age and kind of choose which one you want to do.
Yeah, that's what I like about it, is there's a lot of different things for, like you said, for toddlers, and also for 6, 8, 10-year-olds, and even for 43-year-olds like me. So that all works out pretty good. So I want to mention one more thing. We recently went to Six Flags St. Louis last month. So how does Silver Dollar City compare to Six Flags St. Louis?
Like, it's way better. Like, it's way nicer because, I mean, like, Six Flags, there's just a bunch of kids' rides and mostly coasters. But Silver Dollar City, there's, like, benches for parents who don't want to go on the kids' rides. There's visible areas for the queues. There's lots of shade. Oh, and there's way better food.
Yeah, the food was much better, which is not saying much with when you compare it to Six Flags. Did you also like that there were more indoor rides, too, compared to Six Flags?
Yeah, because, I mean, like, Six Flags has, like, Justice League and shows, and that's it.
Yeah, that's totally true. So, overall, do you think it's worth it to go to Silver Dollar City? Did you have a good time overall there?
I think it's worth it to bring your kids there at least just, like, a day or two. Or at least just go there on a solo trip and ride the coasters. I mean, like, it's a pretty fun park.
Yeah, I agree. So if you were going to rate Silver Dollar City out of 10, how would you rate this park overall? With, like, 10 being, like, Disneyland and Six Flags being, like, 3. How would you rate Silver Dollar City?
Maybe, like, a 7. Because, I mean, like, it's no Disney park with all the dark rides and all that. But, I mean, like, it's way better than Six Flags.
Yes, I think so. That is the takeaway that we all had. Silver Dollar City, way better than Six Flags, especially Six Flags St. Louis. Well, Elise, thanks so much again for being on the show. This was fun, and thanks for going with me to Silver Dollar City.
I can't say no to a theme park.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this trip report of our journey to Silver Dollar City, and I would love to know what you think of this type of podcast. You can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, or follow me on Twitter @tomorrowsoc, or Facebook or Instagram @tomorrowsociety. If you'd like to support the show, of course, you can always leave a rating and review through Apple Podcast or your preferred podcast provider, or you can help to support the show through Patreon. The Tomorrow Society podcast is a listener-supported show. There are no ads or sponsors, and you can learn more about how to help out by going to tomorrowsociety.com/member. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next week, I am going to be talking with Hal Bowers of the Retro Disney World podcast. He came on last year and talked about his background and some stories from his time at the parks. This time we dig even further into Disney MGM Studios and Epcot Center, and possibly why it's such a challenge for those parks to succeed, particularly in the case of Epcot. And that's coming up next week. This was a bonus, so we still are following our normal schedule with interviews. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you again next week.